Welcome to the Parish of the Good Shepherd on this, our third Sunday in our series on Christian minimalism. Father Michael Bousquet here in the Lorraine room, in the common room at the Parish of the Good Shepherd on our tech issues. So this video is my apologies. Hopefully it won't be next week. As I said, three of a 4-week series on Christian minimalism. Welcome to everyone who's here. Please mute yourself. Come in. And let me move to our schedule. So where are we in our book? This Sunday, we'll be talking about chapters 5 and 6 on stewardship and spiritual growth. I should say, I didn't really explain this last week or the week before, but she has these sort of middle chapters 3 through 8 as the 6 areas of a Christian life that are integral to Christian minimalism. And she doesn't really lay them out systematically, but I will do that for you. Last week, we talked about self-care, fellowship in terms of we are members of a community. Okay, so there's no way to do Christian minimalism if in community. Okay, before self-care, we can't do Christian minimalism if we're not taking care of ourselves, right? Great, wonderful concepts. I think we can all agree on that. Well, let's sort of drill down a little bit further. So we are part of a community. We're part of the body of Christ. What are we called to do? We're called to care for one another. We're called to sort of share what we have with other members of the body of Christ. We are called stewards of the gifts that God has given to us, to others and for the world. So this is stewardship. Self-care, wonderful, taking care of yourself, but it's not just taking care of yourself. You're supposed to grow. You're supposed to deepen your relationship with God. So this is spiritual growth, right? So this is where we are. So the unity and the aspects, right? We're drilling down spiritual into stewardship and spiritual growth. And then next week, vocation service. So in a very particular way, we're not just called to be stewards of creation, stewards of the community, but we are called in a very particular way to use our gifts in alignment with God's will, in alignment with God's mission and ministry for ourselves in this world. So that's what vocation is, right? And when we go in terms of spiritual growth, it's not just deepening relationship to God for the benefit of ourselves, right? We deepen our relationship with God. We grow ourselves spiritually so that we can link back to community. So at the very vocation, sort of bring those two, community and self, together, right? So this is how receiving her book to unfold. And so right now we're sort of in the middle stages of drilling down. Next week, we're going to drill down even deeper. So let's talk about, she starts off with this definition of stewardship. Stewardship is utilizing and all resources God provides us to the glory of God and for the building up of God's realm on earth. Wonderful definition of stewardship. I agree with it. We in the Episcopal Church often use the 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure. And she sort of talks about these 3 T's in this chapter. She doesn't define them in that way, but I do. So time. She talks about time in sort of 3 ways, right? Time is not infinite. Time is valuable, and time is to be used wisely. And she has these 3 quotes from the New Testament. So in James, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. So time is not, we have a very limited time here on earth. What are we going to do with our time? Well, partly because it's so limited, it is conduct yourselves wisely towards outsiders, making the most of time. This is Colossians. We have very limited time, therefore precious, and therefore we must make the most of it. And how do we make the most of it? Well, we make the most of it by using it wisely. Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, right, but as wise, making the most of time because the days are evil, right? So do not be foolish, but understand what is the will of the Lord, or what the will of the Lord is. I think we understand how time is a precious commodity in our life, right? Sorry, I'm bringing up my notes here. Right. She has, I think this is my next slide. Yeah. Some ideas we can make best use of our time, right? So again, this is a book of practical self-help. Assess our current schedule, right? And pray over it. So invite God into about using time. Most of us, as she says frequently in this book, move through life unthinking. Don't critically assess how we are using our God-given gifts, right? So if we're going to use time in an intentional way, we have to look at our schedule, what's important, and then pray over it. Invite God in and say, God, how are all these parts of my life that the time that I have? How am I using it? And am I using it in accordance with your will? And she says, stop saying yes. Too often, nice Christian people say yes to everything because that's what we think that we should do. But there's a lot of things we shouldn't say yes to because it sucks away our energy and uses up our time in unproductive ways. So start saying no to things, right? With technology. Technology is the biggest time suck in our lives. Computers, internet, mobile phones, television, these are things that are very rarely useful, very helpful in compressing and relaxing, but we can't use our entire limited amount towards relaxation and sort of mindlessness. So we should absolutely use less of our technology, or not use less, but be more mindful and intentional with how we use it, right? She says there, be more intentional with technology, not get rid of technology altogether or use less, but just be more intentional with the use that you have, right? Spend more time with others. She says most people at the end of their life always regret not spending more time with others. So if you can think of spending more time with your loved ones, do it, because it will invariably be time well. And set aside time for God. How often do we, even faithful Episcopalians, not set aside time for daily prayers, right? Or worship, coming to church. These are incredibly important. And the more that you can carve out time for God, the more time you will around, because we'll explain later, less is more in a certain way. Okay, I'll come back to that. Talent. Tiny little blurb in her book. See chapter 7. So chapter 7, remember, is about vocation, right? So this is going to be drilling down in stewardship. How are we using ourselves in service of our vocation, our calling, right? So put a pin in that. We'll come back to the talent part of time, talent, treasure next week. But treasure, so money, our material wealth, our possessions, right? The heading in her section on treasure is money is not the answer to happiness. And of course, we think we know this, right? And it's the love of money, not money in particular, right? This over here. So, the love of money, right, is the root of all kinds of evil. This is 1 Timothy. Most of us know the first part of the love of the root of all kinds of evil. Most people don't really pay attention to the second part of the quote, but I think it's very apt. So the second part, in their eagerness to reach, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with nails. I paid attention to that because, as she does explain, we injure ourselves when we strive to accumulate more. And when we get to that part in my presentation, I'll have a callback to this 1 Timothy passage. Overall, right, she talks about not serve two masters, right? One will either love the one and hate the other, or love the second and hate the first. So God is guiding and help us to live as we were created to live, as people loving and serving God, not money. I don't know where Dawn will fall in the presentation, but I will talk about it. I do know that I have actually the quote. I do have that will speak directly to your question. I'll come to it a little bit later. I think treasure. I think this might be it, Dawn. So pay attention, right? So we're still talking about money and treasure. She talks about the parable of prodigal son because the God-given treasure that we have, right, our assets, she very much wants to link up to inheritance. If you remember back to the parable of the prodigal son demands of his father, I want a share of the inheritance now. Often he spends it in dissolute living. And then he comes back and the father gives him, reconciles, but his half of the inheritance is spent. He has no more, right? So being good stewards of inheritance means being very judicious with how we spend our inheritance, what in terms of monetary assets, and either given through inheritance, like from a will, or what we've been given, quote unquote, through what we've earned of our labor. Our labor has given us certain assets, certain material wealth, but that's in some ways inherited in her theology. It's something that should be stewarded as a gift, not something to serve, right? That's, I think, a wrong way of always approaching labor and wages, right? Understand that even the fruit of our labor is part of God-given talents to be able to work and produce. And so I like sticking with inheritance for here. And she even links it with inheritance in terms of we are heirs with Christ of salvation. So because our inheritance in Jesus Christ is our salvation, we don't have to worry earning our way to heaven. We are free to use time, given talents, and money to serve God and others. Okay, I think this is actually quite important. If we in our lifetimes are focused on working, on money, right? We can very much get into that mindset. Okay, I deserve the wealth that I've accumulated. I've deserved the wealth that I've earned, literally, quote unquote, earned through my labor. And yet, if we go back and say that all of what we are is a gift from God, and this is putting the cart before the horse, because we really should talk about talents before we talk about treasure in this regard, right? Because our talents are those aspects of ourselves that have enabled us to acquire treasure, right? In this regard, if we treasure as being an outgrowth of our talents, which are an outgrowth of God-given gifts, well, then it's not something that we deserve, but something that has ultimately been given to us, right? And if we don't have to earn our way into heaven, right, then we can sort of detach ourselves from earning in this lifetime and see that what we have can be used to serve God and serve others. It's really reorienting our focus in life to a more ministerial life than an egotistical life, right? Because if you are focused on accumulating wealth that you deserve for yourself, it's very hard to break open your heart and let other people and others and on God. This is what we talked about last week on Masters, or why it's well man to enter the kingdom of heaven, because they rely on themselves, not on God, right? So I think, let's see, I think one of these quotes will talk to your point, Dawn. Many people assume, oh, this is good. Many people assume that being a minimalist means less is always better. I'm pulling out this quote because I think it's a very salient point. And because, especially here in Good Shepherd and in Waban, most of us have too much right now, well, focusing, right, is better at the beginning of this process. But having too little is just as detrimental as having too much. The goal is having enough. Goldilocks was onto something. Just right amount of. Minimalism is about having enough. Too much, and we're overwhelmed. Too little, and unfulfilled. She even has a little section on this hierarchy of needs, right? So being minimalist is not just about tearing everything away and living in that box of a house, right, with nothing but a bed and maybe a cup of water, right? It's not nothing. It is about having enough, and not too much, but not too little. And to this point, enough is different for each of us. Your enough will be different from your friend's enough. Minimalism is a process of experimentation to figure out your own personal happy medium. Ultimately, that we can trust that God provides enough. And I think this is where we're getting to, Dawn, with your question about, well, my sentiment that God will provide enough, but God actually does not provide toilet paper and a roof over your head or any of these things. We actually have to work to produce that for ourselves. And I think the solution is what I had just explained previously, which is God gives us talents, right? And we use our talents, our intellect, our strength, maybe our skill, even our personality, right? Our personality, or our affect, our heart, our empathy. whatever it is that makes us ourselves, we use this in service of whatever career we've decided to do in life, right? And because of our career or our multiple careers, we've been able to accrue wealth, right? We've saved money. We buy those toiletries, the toilet paper, the food that we eat, the house, the roof over our heads, right? All of these things. And I think the spiritual practice is to recognize, okay, yes, the immediate past, it is me who has gotten and provided all these things myself. But if you take a further step back, I was only able to do this because of what God has given me, right? And I think that's a stumbling block for many people, even many Christians, right? We don't go back far enough and attribute God to everything in our life. We only stop at ourselves and say, aha, it's because of me, full stop, period. You know, that's all that I have. And it is a spiritual practice to consciously and intentionally God and attribute God for all the things that you have. And not to wave that off as an existential attribution to God. Yes, God is responsible also for saying wonderful, but no, it's my own hard work that I've done this. Take a step back and say, really lean into that existential thanks and saying, yes, this is because of God. It's a change in disposition, a change in your orientation towards who you recognize your master, right? In this case, it's God. So I think that might be, at least for me, that's my solution. And when we come back to the questions and comments later, we can break this open a little bit more, Dawn, and others, if you have similar question or complaint about God and us as who is the provider. Okay. Spirit, the coin here. So if stewardship is about how we're using our God-given gifts and talents for others and for ourselves, yes, but also for the world, how are we aware of ourselves? Not just self-care, but how are we deepening our relationship with God? She puts in here, interestingly, this is sort of an outgrowth of treasure, right? Proverbs 1:19, and she was reading the Psalms and the Proverbs, and she came across this verse of Proverbs, such is the fate of all who are greedy for money, it robs them of life. Well, that's a great reading. She actually read it again in a different translation, the Message, which is a more sort of colloquial translation of the Bible with contemporary language. And the Message translates it as, grab all that you can get. That's what happens. The more you get, less you are. And she really thinks about this and realizes, yeah, that is the case. I'll pull out of here some of the things that she mentions. Yeah, if you focus using time and your energy, right, you're going to lose your time and your energy. So typical examples portrayed in movies and TV shows, someone who works more and more hours for more money, right? And then has too little time for their family at the end of the day, right? We can lose our God-given resources. So if we focus on getting more and spend, right, then we're probably going to go into debt. Or we're going to be very limited in how we can focus on God and our neighbor. The more that we tend to accumulate, the less we're able to be generous, right, and help those who don't have as much as we do. Getting more and more often means that others continue to go without. And so you think maybe globally and how resources are allotted in this world. If we overconsume, there's a price for that in the developing world. And she also says we lose our true identity. This is getting to this particular quote from Proverbs. The more you get, the less you lose your identity, right? Because God calls us to be children of God, right? To serve and serve others using our spiritual gifts and skills to gain is actually misusing our gifts and skills, right? We're used to use our gifts to build up God's kingdom, not to build up ourselves, right? So to build up ourselves is really to lose the purpose that God has given us as children of God. So how do we sort of deepen our relationship with God? How do we grow deeper in our, she says, practice being still, right? She has a little story there about how she broke her foot in seminary, and her friend said, yeah, God is telling you, you need to slow down. And it was actually true. Or herself, right? The friend asked, what is the lesson to be learned from a broken foot? And yes, slowing down is exactly what God is asking me to do. And then surrender as well. She has another quote from Proverbs: trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend upon your own understanding. Seek his will in all that you do, and he will show you which path to take. So trusting in the Lord, again, not to call you out, but it is not to say that God was going to rain down material goods upon me and everything is taken. It's trusting that God's spirit enlivening my heart and guiding my mind and my heart in which path to take will actually to having enough, right? It's not just I get to sit back and provides, but God be the means in order to be able to help and to care for others, right? She has a lot of difficulty with surrender. She says, if I'm honest with myself, my obsession with planning, she's a big planner, comes from my control. I want to control what happens, when it happens, how it happens, where it happens, it happens. And surrendering is hard work, right? Emotionally, basically my previous life. Every time she has to let a possession go, she feels sad, she grieves. Even letting go of bad habits, things that are bad for her, she still grieves letting go of that herself. Here's the thing: surrender equals freedom. So this is, I'm sorry to be so existential. I'm a philosopher by this is a philosophical approach to life. And I don't think there's any way to get around that. If you are much more oriented, this is going to be a learning curve. But she says, right, when we surrender to God, when we lean on God's understanding and not our own, when we seek God's will, knows us which path to take. God knows what's best for us. And we give up control. We free our follow God's will and not work so hard at our own plans, right? So if you think that you are master and commander of your own life, that's a lot on your shoulders, right? If you trust that God is leading you appropriately, that's quite a relief. You've taken a lot of burden off of your shoulders. It might just be an existential burden, but it can actually have some real, I think, effects and positive effects on your heart and on your soul. You will. Where are we? Oh, okay. Prayer types. She has in here a lot of different spiritual practices. Each of these bullet points she has an explanation of what they are. And when I first went through this, I thought, oh, this is another laundry list of self-help sort of practicality. But then I actually came to appreciate it. I'm a priest. I've been in ministry and in formation of some professional formation for decades, now over 20 years. Every time I've gone to a retreat, to a spiritual center, place to renew myself, they always give you some sort of prayer to do. And they might give you one or two, and you sort of have to sit down and engage exercise. And invariably I feel, oh, this is bogus. I don't like this. This does not work for me, right? And what I've realized is maybe it's just that particular prayer type does not work for me, or it doesn't work for me at that particular time in my life. And so I'm actually appreciative that she laid, 15 or so different prayer types here and explains them in her book, because some of these might not work for you, but some might. For example, I can't stand journaling. I think journaling is a big waste of time. Some people might love journaling, but try on another of these, and you'll find that maybe this is you can deepen your prayer life, your spiritual life with God. Some of these are great, some of these are not so great for me, and the same is true for everyone. Some of these will work for you, and some don't. This last point, fasting, she actually has a sort of extended explanation on fasting. She has tried to fast, and she had an entire year where she did not buy anything, with some big caveats. Of course, she's allowed to buy some things, right? But the big things she's not allowed to buy. And she learned after her year sort of 3 points. The first is that we often buy and consume on automatic pilot. We don't think about how we are consuming stuff, right? And point 2, we regularly mix up our wants and our needs. This is very true, especially true for my 3-year-old son, Elio, and says he needs something and he doesn't need it, he wants it. I keep trying to teach him the difference between want and need, and he just cannot get it in his little 3-year-old mind. Well, I've known 40-year-olds, I've known 60-year-olds who also can't differentiate between want and need. It is hard for us humans to think, but we can, if we apply our minds to it and live intentionally, we can figure out what is it that we need versus what is it that we just simply want. And she realized we need more than we think we do, right? That's her 3rd point. Fasting is big. A lot of us think about fasting in terms of food, but she says you can fast in all areas of life. You can fast in terms of your consumption of electronic devices. So you put away the computer, put away the phone at certain times of the day or even certain times of the year, right? When I was growing up, my parents would always turn off the television for Lent for 40 days. And that was back before there was internet. So 40 days of literally just nothing but board games and reading books. I don't know if we could do that now in the 21st century, but hey, if you want to try it, be my guest. I'll see you again in Easter. But her exercise, I found this quite, she explained her own engagement with fasting by spending a year, 18, fasting from all shopping. Of course, she has to buy food, right? In life, right? Food, necessities, medicine, toiletries, cosmetics, only when I ran out. Things necessary to run household appliances like batteries, only when she ran out, right? Cleaning supplies, gifts for loved ones, books, because she's, a theologian, she's going to need books, right? And of course, experiences, going out to the movies, going out to eat with friends or date nights with her husband. They're like, wow, you're actually not fasting from anything. That's what I thought. But, if you are someone who is, who's beset by overconsumption, always on Amazon, clicking, buying and stuff, well, then absolutely, this might actually feel like an abridged lifestyle, a lifestyle that's very much pared down. Everyone's Christian minimalism is different. Minimalism for her is different than minimalism for me or for you. So interesting that she lays it out that way. The things that she did fast from were buying clothes, shoes, accessories, electronics, and household items that weren't necessities. So a whole lot in there that, for her was probably hard at the beginning. And then she says by the end of 2018, leaned into this Christian minimalist lifestyle. And, from my perspective, I'm pretty much already there, right? And I'm actually being a minimalist. So maybe for me, minimalism is a little more pared down than even for Becca Ehrlich. So that's where I think, right, that closes us out for today. Next week, we'll talk about the last two aspects of the 6 aspects of Christian minimalism. So vocation and service. And then we'll close it up with living an abundant life, because again, it's not just paring down and focusing, but more constructively building an intentional life and a life that is oriented toward abundance. So that's where we're going to finish our week. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions and comments.
I do know what you mean about sort of trusting God and not pretending that he's going to buy the paper towels and things. But, I'm always amazed, and I think I've said this in previous adult forums in one context or another. I'm always so amazed and so impressed by, and often jealous of, sometimes there'll be something on the news about a horrible weather disaster or something, and whole neighborhood, and they've lost their homes literally. And they'll sometimes, they're beautiful homes, but a lot of times you can tell when they show it on the news that the homes remaining are modest at best. So they probably were all like that. They're all really not much of a house. And when the residents are being interviewed on TV, the minute they start speaking, it becomes apparent that they haven't had a lot of formal education anyway, And so now you're listening to these people who really had nothing, and they don't have a lot of talent, perhaps, and treasure. And they'll actually say things like right on television, like, well, I just, we're all alive, and, I'm just, God's going to take care of me. I mean, sometimes they'll actually say that on TV. If you're in a more politically correct environment, you think, well, I probably won't say that because I'm on TV, but they don't care. That's really how they feel. And I always think how wonderful that is, that the first thing that they're thinking is, God's going to take care of me. And the other thing that relates to it is her slide when she says, ultimately, God will provide. I think that, ultimately, it doesn't mean that, so if I really let all of my supplies at home disappear, then the paper towels would show up at the door. I mean, of course not, but I think it has more to do with if you have that level of discernment, which I do not, but if you have that level of discernment about what God has in mind for me, then if you really feel that way, then maybe you can feel that I'll get some pointers from my beliefs about what might be best for me. Because I don't buy into that rationale when people, like, they really pray that their kid gets into a certain university, or they just pray that they get that job, or pray that they get that mortgage. And then none of those things happen. And some people will say, well, that wasn't God's will. But if the kid got into the university and they got the job and they got the mortgage, then that was God's will. I just don't buy that. I mean, maybe I'm just jealous of people who have that level of discernment, but I don't think it's just that. I just think it's a promise of his presence. And so perhaps if you feel that presence, you may in fact feel that he is providing for you in a better way, not literally providing the shoes that your kids need, but providing a certain comfort level or something to you. That's how I see it.
So, to go back to the first thing you said, Dawn, about people who have been natural disasters. I say God will provide. Invariably, they do have provisions for them, because communities like that typically rally around people in need. And so if it's not professional organizations like the Red Cross, churches often have an outpouring and become a locus of giving within devastated communities. If you look to tornadoes in the Midwest and what happened after Hurricane Katrina, often being the ones that brought all the neighbors together, right? And so lo and behold, we're taken care of. But it's not that, again, God sort of rained down riches from the heavens. It's just that people trusted in their neighbors to be able to help them. And they helped their neighbors themselves, right? Even with whatever little they were out there, cutting up wood and boarding up windows or whatever it is for their neighbor, even if their own house was entirely destroyed. Communities that come together and support one another are exactly those communities where the individual people have that disposition. God will provide, because how does God provides through us? We are God's hands and feet in the world, right? So that's, I think, where that theology comes from, and that type of spirituality. Whereas, those of us here in Waban, or in Eastern Massachusetts, who have much more substantial homes, who have a lot of reserve, right? Either we've got stockpiled toilet paper in a closet in our house that might hire, right? We might not need to go to Costco for an entire year because we have a lot of toilet paper, or we have monetary. We've got money in our 401k. We have money in IRAs and in probably stock portfolios as well, right? So we have a financial cushion that we're not even touching that money, right? This is stuff for the future, maybe even for our children or grandchildren, right? So those of us who have, I won't say excess, right? Because the definition of Christian minimalism is for every person, right? So it's perhaps not excess, but it is definitely a type of cushion that makes us much less reliant upon our community. So that, if things go bad, we can still perhaps rely upon our cushion. We don't have to turn to our neighbors. It's harder for us to have that spirituality of, oh, God will provide, meaning that my life is so intimately tied to my neighbors that we all rise and fall as a group. When one of us is in need, we're all in need. When one of us is prosperous, we're kind of siloed in our not excess. I'm going to say in our cushion, right? We still might desire community, but we don't need community the way that people a little bit on the socioeconomic ladder might need. And I think it's something that's very difficult for those of us in this place, in this world, right? To cultivate a real need for our community, right? It's a hard spiritual practice. Yeah.
So Michael, I have so many thoughts running through my head around this woman and around our population in the United States, and those who are poor and help each other, and those who are rich and kick people off school boards, and those who are, I just am having number one, who did the author hope would read this book? Who did she write it for? I think I'll just say, Dawn, you're being the total optimist in all of this, and I think I guess I don't think of myself as a cynic, but I look at this kind of development that she's asking us to sort of work towards, and I say, four of us here, maybe. What about everybody else? The guy who has the FUCK Biden flag on the back of his, F-1500. I don't know. I'm enjoying reading it. I find a little bit of difficulty with some of her, I don't like her using the word garbage all the time about throwing things away. I have a million things written down, but I guess the first question I had was, who did she write it for? Who did she hope would read this? And how did she what did she hope the effect would be? And I mean, who's she talking to?
So I don't know, but I can guess that she's writing this very widely. This is for who would like to read it, right? And in the Episcopal Church and in the Lutheran Church as well, because she's Lutheran, it's not just sort of, upper middle class and wealthy people in the Northeast, right? If you go to the Midwest, you can find Lutherans and Episcopalians who are salt of the earth, right? They are right there. So it's not a thing. It's I think anyone can access this book. It is harder for us, right? And I'm not say that we are like the wealthy villains of Scripture, right? Who resolves and sort of throw into the trash, right? So ignore the poor and marginalize others. That's not who we are. We're definitely loving people, but it is hard for us to rely upon others because it's so easy for us to rely on ourselves, right? Because we have. And I think that's, in this regard, her message for us, for me at least. I'm going to speak for myself. I don't want to speak for anyone else at Good Shepherd, but I will speak for myself. Challenge, because it needs to essentially become uncomfortable, to discomfort myself, because so much abundance and so much cushion in my life, and perhaps to live a little bit more on the edge so that I can be more in tune with others who are in need, and therefore my own need for others. I'd spin on it. using the word garbage is provocative. And if you notice the passages, she's referring to Paul, St. Paul, the very translation of that text. I'm going to, there you go. Yeah, this is,
he actually said refuse.
So the translation, this is Philippians 3, verses 7 and 8. The translation she uses in this book is the New Life translation. This is not the New Revised Standard Version. She does use the New Revised Standard Version for most of her scripture passages. It's only when she has in parentheses a different translation that you know she's a different translation. And she's using it here for that very particular effect, right? This is when Paul, in Christianity, converting to disciple of Jesus, says, for his sake, I have discarded everything else, counting it all as garbage so that I could become one with him. Well, I think she used that translation so that, you have this visceral image of garbage. It's not, we'll say, that Christian minimalism looks different for every type of person, might be coming into play here. So for her accumulation of physical things was really dragging her down, and it was helpful for her to view it as garbage, something to unburden herself from. Whereas, for myself, right, my entire closet filled with toilet paper so I don't have to go to Costco for the next year, right? I don't view that as garbage. I view that as a wise use of my resources, because I bought all that toilet paper on sale, right, when it was on sale. And I will eventually use it all, right? So maybe that was not garbage, but maybe that's a use of stewarding my resources. Take what she has with a grain of salt, Mary Grace. Again, it might not work for you, and that's perfectly okay too, right?
No, well, there are certainly parts that do work for me. I didn't realize there was actually a name for the prayer life, the one at examine. I guess it's an actual theological term where at the end of the day. So, I mean, there are things that I looked at that I liked, and I wonder in books like this. It's for personal growth, I guess. I mean, I would like to think that everybody in the world would read this and have have reached whatever stage of Erickson's stages of development, that they would have the ability to sort of work through this, and not get hung up at stage 5 or whatever it is. I don't know. So that's the cynic part of me. I say, yeah, this is great, but what difference is it going to make overall in the whole world? And are people really going to be able to evolve in this way to become a minimalist so that the world will be better, not just for them, but for everybody?
So we'll get to this perhaps next week, but what I'll say for now is this is for you and for me, right? I don't want to take this book and start beating it over the head of other people and say, you need to become a minimalist. This is for you, and you feel called to reorient your life in this intentional type of way. I definitely don't want to start going out into the world and saying, everyone must read this book, because then it does become a bit violent, right? This is supposed to be an invitation to, in this regard, spiritual growth. Deepen your relationship to God. And you can do this by following these very practical steps, right, in her book. And some of these steps work for you, some of them don't, and that's perfectly fine, as she says. And the outcome, what it will look like for each individual person, is going to vary. So that's also something to remember. And there are some people out there, like myself, right? I didn't consider myself a Christian minimalist, but according to her definition of her year of fasting, I'm already there. So, wow, maybe I need to grow in other ways, right? So maybe in terms of consumption of goods, maybe that's the area of growth. Area of growth lies somewhere else, perhaps focusing more on my vocation, perhaps trying to do different prayer types instead of pigeonholing myself into the exam typically. So anyway, we are at time. It's past 12:30. Other comments, though, before we wrap up? Mary Ellen or Joy?
I wanted to mention about time. We're used to having this group with Adult Forum for the full hour until 12:45. And if the group doesn't mind, and if it's okay with you, I just wanted to actually do that as a housekeeping thing, because I think we were always used to the full hour, and then when we slipped even over that, and that's what happened 2 weeks ago when it went to close to 1 o'clock, and then you check with Father Jay, what time is it supposed to end? You know, if the group doesn't mind it slipping over, just so that we can have a more fuller conversation, and you know, it doesn't mind, you know, I don't mind. Now, if everybody wants to stay for, you know, until the next few minutes.
I hear you, Mary Ellen, absolutely saying that you can talk for longer and would like more time. At least on my end, I think we're more limited. So, you know, this might be an opportunity to, hey, here's an invitation. Come to church, right? Because we can end the adult forum, but if with people here, conversation lasts much longer. But
it's gone through iterations, Michael. It's just gone through lots of iterations. Yeah. It was always 45 minutes. It was always like 11:15 to 12 or something, or 11:30 to 12:15. I think that's what it always was. And then it went through a period of time when it was a little bit longer, and then it just got out of control because it just went on and on and on. You know, I like 45 minutes, but more important than that, I like deciding on a time. I don't care for it when people then say, so if anybody wants to stick around, because, you know, you'd like to hear the whole thing. And if you can't stick around, then you sort of feel like, gee, what did you say? And I know we can go watch it on TV, and I get all that, but you can't contribute.
So this might be an of our time intentionally. So we ended this to be 45 minutes from 11:45 to 12:30. That's where we are right now. And we'll intentionally use it in that way.
So that means I should hold my thoughts till next week and jump in early?
Well, you can ask a question or share a thought, but we won't answer it or how about that, Joy?
Well, I wanted to share just thoughts that came into my head. One was when Dawn was talking about God will provide. It was such an easy answer. And I know exactly how she's feeling about that. It's just too easy. But what came to me is what we say at the offertory: all things come of thee, O God, and of thine own have we given thee. So essentially, that plus Mary Grace's question about for whom did she write this book, my thought was, well, we're reading it. She's talking about spiritual growth. She's talking about Christianity. And compare that to Marie Kondo, the Japanese person who hers is all about decluttering. It has nothing to do with God. And so I think she wrote this book to help guide us in our priorities in life.
Thank you, Joy. Any last comments before we stop our share and also stop the recording? It's over here. If not,
Michael.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you next Sunday.
Thanks, Michael. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Father Michael.